April 9th, 1993 marked Good Friday on the calendar. On this day, 4 El Paso teenagers were oblivious to the fact that a simple twist of fate was about to forever change their lives. After partying throughout the evening, in the early morning hours of April 10th, 17-year-old Armando Lazo, 18-year-old Robert England, 17-year-old Jesse Hernandez, and 18-year-old Juan Medina were on their way home. On their walk home, they took the Electric Street in El Paso County, an alley notorious in the area for criminal activity. Just after midnight, a suspicious maroon car approached them from behind. Realizing there was something wrong, the teenagers began to panic. But a moment later, they were relieved when the car sped up, turning onto another street, only to return shortly after. This time, the headlights of the car were off. Under the murky sky, 6 gunshots were fired from the passenger side of a vehicle towards the 4 helpless teens. While Jesse and Juan ran away, assuming their friends were right behind them, Armando and Robert faced a different fate. 18-year-old Robert England suffered a single shot to the head, which resulted in an instant death. 17-year-old Armando was shot once in his abdomen and once in his thigh before he ran about 50 yards to a nearby house and collapsed on the lawn. He later died from his injuries. Police found 6 shell casings in the middle of the street at the crime scene. The tests performed on them later confirmed that they were fired from a .22 caliber. Unfortunately, those shell casings were the only evidence police could gather. The Good Friday shooting had made waves in the media. With pressure mounting, Detective Alfonso Marquez, who was leading the investigation, was determined to crack the case by hook or by crook. With no other physical or forensic evidence or eyewitness testimony to go on, investigators needed a confession. The detectives assigned to the case were known for breaking tricky cases and extracting confessions from suspects. Over the next few days, they interrogated several people, but nothing panned out until they came across the statement of a teenage boy. Following a tip, on April 21, 1993, the El Paso Police Department contacted an El Paso resident, Patricia Rangel, telling her they needed to speak to her son, David Rangel, regarding a telephone harassment complaint. Instead, in the interrogation room, 17-year-old David Rangel was questioned regarding the Good Friday shooting. Though he told the detectives that he had no knowledge of the crime, the detectives kept pressuring him for information. They falsely said that David's friends already implicated him in the crime, and if he didn't come clean, he'd be spending the rest of his life in jail where he'd be sexually assaulted. Under pressure, David came up with some information. It just so happened that shortly after the shooting, David's 16-year-old cousin, Daniel Villegas, told him over a phone call that he was the one who shot the victims with a shotgun due to a gang-related dispute. Daniel was a jokester who often bragged and lied about things to make himself seem tougher. David never believed the story, but after hours of interrogation, he relayed this information to the detectives. To Marquez, this was a jackpot. Despite David repeatedly telling him that Daniel talked about using a shotgun, which completely contradicted the evidence found at the scene, Marquez ignored it and made David sign the document of his statement, which had no mention of the weapon. Next in line to face the wrath of the investigators was 16-year-old Daniel Villegas. Around 10 p.m. that same evening, Villegas was arrested and taken to Juvenile Investigative Services. There, handcuffed to a chair, Detective Marquez began to question him. At first, Daniel denied any connection to the crime. His alibi was that he was babysitting and watching a movie on the night of the murder. This would never be taken into consideration. Instead, Marquez threatened him, saying that he'd be taken to the desert and beaten if he did not comply. As a 16-year-old who had just minor run-ins with the law, Daniel had never been interrogated before. This interrogation, where he was repeatedly threatened and even slapped, would have been terrifying for the teen. But the final nail in the coffin was that Marquez told him that he'd die by electric chair if he did not confess. During the next hour or so, Marquez and Daniel worked on the confession. Although it still contained inconsistencies, Daniel signed a document that closely matched the crime. Within a few hours of getting out of the interrogation room, Daniel recanted his confession. He told a juvenile probation officer that he didn't commit the murders and only confessed because he was scared and was tired of the detectives harassing him. Unfortunately, by then, it was too late. Daniel Villegas was charged with capital murder. Daniel's first trial occurred in December 1994. It seemed like Villegas would be exonerated as the physical evidence was in his favor. Though David Rangel testified for the prosecution, he maintained that Daniel was joking about his involvement in the shooting. Detective Marquez's interrogation tactics were also brought to light by the defense. Additionally, several defense witnesses said that Daniel had a history of lying. A forensic psychiatrist who examined him said he had emotional problems and possible mild mental retardation, conditions that would make him susceptible to police pressure. Yet the defense presented him as an active gang member, as well as a reckless killer who had already confessed to this crime. The trial ended with a hung jury, deadlocked at 11-1 in favor of conviction. Daniel's second trial started in August 1995. The lead prosecutor from the first trial was again presenting the case. Daniel, who had been declared indigent, now had a new court-appointed attorney. Although his previous lawyer offered to again represent him, that request was denied by the court. Having been assigned the case barely 2 months before trial was set, the new attorney had next to no time to prepare his defense and failed to ask for a continuance. The defense efforts fell short, and the jury found Daniel Villegas guilty of murdering 2 people. On August 24, 1995, Daniel Villegas was sentenced to life in prison. Because he was a minor, he was spared the death penalty. After multiple appeals failed for a retrial, the Villegas family, desperate to free him, wrote a letter to the Innocence Project in the hopes of getting help. While they were waiting for an answer, an unexpected offer of assistance would present itself. It was now 2007, and Daniel Villegas had been behind bars for 12 years. It was then that he met John Mimbella for the first time. Mimbella was the owner of a multi-state construction business and a well-respected man in El Paso. But his connection to Daniel was a bit more personal. He'd married Daniel's former sister-in-law, who later insisted he look at Daniel's case. At first, as a man who always believed in the criminal justice system, Mimbella was skeptical. But as a favor to his new wife, he agreed to take a look at the case. He sat down for hours and reviewed all the paperwork, read through all the police reports, scanned through all the news reports, and scoured through all the transcripts of the trials. The deeper he dug, the more convinced he became of Daniel's innocence. Mimbella met with the local DA and presented all of his findings, hoping that he could get assistance. He requested that the DA reopen the case, but the DA immediately turned him down. So John Mimbella, determined to overturn the wrongful conviction, became an advocate and the financier behind the efforts to free Daniel Villegas. He became a voice for Daniel by organizing rallies and protests, as well as paying for billboards urging the state to exonerate Daniel Villegas. Using his own money, he even hired a private investigator to look into the case. The private investigator, Freddy Bonilla, one of the best in El Paso, soon reached one of the survivors of the shooting, Jesse Hernandez, to compare Daniel's confession to his account and possibly identify the inconsistencies. Jesse had never seen the confession, and he was really surprised to see that the confession did not match the facts, just as the private investigator had anticipated. When Jesse learned that Detective Marquez was present during the confession, his face turned pale. As it turned out, when Jesse was brought in for questioning on April 12, 1993, Marquez was the one who questioned him about the incident. Jesse repeated what he knew and did not know, but Marquez became angry and said that the other survivor, Juan Medina, had already told police that Jesse had killed their friends. As the torturous interrogation continued, he was close to confessing to a crime he didn't commit, even though he was one of the intended targets. With this new information and all the other discrepancies in the case, Mimbella hired one of the best defense lawyers in town, Joe Spencer. Spencer, along with his team, got to work to get Daniel a new trial. On December 18, 2013, Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Daniel was entitled to a new trial because of ineffective counsel. When the state prepared for a third trial, Daniel was released on bail on January 14, 2014. With his limited freedom, Daniel got on with his life. He got a job at Mimbella's company, got married, and had 3 children. But the fear that one day he might have to go to prison was on his mind every moment, so much that he could not fully enjoy his freedom. The trial was supposed to begin in early 2015, but was delayed for several reasons. Meanwhile, Daniel's defense team had moved to suppress his 1993 confession. Judge Medrano ruled in their favor, saying that it was inadmissible, as it was obtained by coercive conduct by police officers. Before the trial, Daniel was also offered an Alford's plea, in which he could plead guilty while still maintaining his innocence. This would allow him to remain out of prison, as he'd already served 16 years at that point. But Daniel decided to bet on the truth and declined the plea. The third trial began October 1, 2018. This time, prosecutors couldn't use Daniel's confession, and much of the police's investigative work had been discredited. Instead, the state relied on David Rangel, who again testified that Daniel had said he had shot the men. Under cross-examination, David also said he knew his cousin was joking. Apart from that, the defense called 33 additional witnesses, which included Daniel's alibi for the night of the murder and Jesse Hernandez. Finally, after a 25-year-long battle for justice, on October 5, 2018, Daniel Villegas was found not guilty of murder.
Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
After his long-awaited exoneration, Daniel is happily embracing his newfound freedom and raising his 4 children with his wife. Always grateful to John Membella, he still works at his company advocating for other wrongfully convicted individuals. The true shooter remains unknown. On the morning of June 17, 2004, 68-year-old Carol Barris and her 47-year-old daughter, Cheryl Williams, were found stabbed to death in their home at 121 Vagabond Way in Altamont Springs, Florida. The crime was reported to police by Mark Van Sant shortly before 9 a.m. Mark said he discovered the bodies on his way to pick up clothes for his girlfriend, Samantha Williams, who was the daughter of Cheryl Williams and the granddaughter of Carol Barris. According to Mark, his girlfriend Samantha lived with Cheryl and Barris, but spent the previous night at his home, and that she'd gone to work directly from Mark's home that morning. At the crime scene, deputies from Seminole County Sheriff's Office discovered that Cheryl had been stabbed and bled to death. Her body was found blocking the front door of the house, whereas Carol, who was partially paralyzed after suffering a stroke, was on the living room floor next to her wheelchair, lying in a pool of blood. Police also discovered a bloody 10-inch kitchen knife between the residence and the house next door. Samantha, who had come to the scene after police contacted her, pointed towards a possible suspect. She said she had a gut feeling that the attacker was 24-year-old Clemente Aguirre Haquin, who lived next door with 2 roommates at 117 Vagabond Way. Clemente, a 24-year-old immigrant from Honduras, worked at a local restaurant where he washed dishes and prepped food for minimal pay. One of his duties was washing the knives. He had entered illegally into the U.S. after fleeing from his native Honduras when narcotics traffickers tried to force him to become a member of their gang. Clemente was acquainted with Cheryl, Carol, and Samantha and would occasionally visit them at their house. Samantha told the investigators that one night a few months prior to the murders, she woke up at 2 a.m. to find Clemente standing over her bed. Scared for her life, she told him to leave, escorted him out, and locked the front door behind him. The next day, she warned him that he was not allowed to enter their home without permission, especially at night. From the start, police looked at Clemente as a possible suspect based on Samantha's account. But the suspicion grew stronger when deputies went to talk to Clemente and his 2 roommates. All 3 of them denied any connection to the murder. However, later in the day, Clemente voluntarily went to the police station to share his side of the story. He said that the day before the murders, he had the day off from work. He spent the day with his friends and drank throughout the day and into the night before returning home at 5 a.m. He was out of beer and the store wouldn't open for another hour. He claimed he decided to walk next door to ask for beer. That's when he came across Cheryl's body. Clemente further told the deputies that, after seeing Cheryl's body, he attempted to revive her. After realizing she was dead, he entered the house and discovered Carol's body in the living room. He picked up the knife lying next to her body in case the killer was still in the house. After leaving the house, he dropped the knife in the grass outside. He said that he did not call the police because he was an illegal immigrant and was afraid of being deported. Upon searching the shared apartment of Clemente, police retrieved a bag of clothing. The bag contained a t-shirt, underwear, socks, and a pair of shorts, all of which contained blood from both victims. At the crime scene, police found 67 bloody shoe impressions, of which 64 were consistent with Clemente's shoes. His fingerprints were also present on the murder weapon. The autopsy revealed that Carol was stabbed twice with a 10-inch blade, and Cheryl was stabbed a whopping 129 times. Clearly, a crime of passion. Cheryl had severe wounds to her lungs and leg, one of which severed her femoral artery. She was also stabbed in the arms, legs, back, hands, feet, and chest. But one stab wound to her left lung was considered the fatal wound. She also had numerous defensive wounds on her hands and feet that suggested an extremely violent struggle. Other than a stab on her back, Carol died from a stab wound that severed her left ventricle. As the investigation progressed, detectives found that a 10-inch chef's knife similar to the murder weapon was missing from the restaurant where Clemente was employed, which further strengthened their suspicion. Clemente's story sounded baseless to the investigators, so on June 25, 2004, they arrested Clemente for tampering with evidence from a crime scene, which was eventually changed to first-degree murder. As all the evidence seemed to be against Clemente, investigators never bothered to look anywhere else. Despite Clemente sticking to his story, prosecutors prepared a strong case against him. He went to trial in February 2006 in Seminole County Circuit Court. On February 28, 2006, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder and burglary. Clemente continued to protest his innocence. However, his insistence that he was innocent fell on deaf ears, and the judge sentenced him to death.
I didn't do it. I don't kill nobody.
In 2009, Clemente filed a motion for a new trial, but was denied and led the Florida Supreme Court to sustain his convictions and death sentence. In 2011, Clemente's lawyers reached out to the Innocence Project to help in seeking DNA testing of more than 80 pieces of evidence. The results of the tests brought attention to another suspect, Samantha Williams, the daughter and granddaughter of the respective victims, whom police had never before looked at. Clemente was excluded as a source of the DNA at the scene, and Samantha's DNA was found in 8 locations that investigators contended were consistent with her being the attacker. The evidence was presented at an evidentiary hearing in 2003. In addition to that, Clemente's legal team also presented evidence that Samantha had a history of mental illness and had been taken to the hospital about 60 times for psychiatric evaluations. Reportedly, on one of those occasions, while being transported by police, she told the cops that her mother and grandmother had died for her, but she did not further explain. Although Samantha acknowledged having a violent temper and being treated for mental illness, she denied slaying her mother and grandmother. However, she did admit to arguing with her mother hours before the killing. One of the most significant testimonies came from Mark Van Sant. He said that although he and Samantha went to bed at his home on the night of the murders, he was deeply asleep and could not say that she didn't leave during the night. Though this testimony did not rule out Samantha as a potential killer, it was also unable to directly place Samantha in the murder scene. In August 2013, a circuit judge denied the motion for a new trial, ruling that the DNA evidence alone was not enough to convince a jury to acquit Clemente. Instead of giving up hope, Clemente's defense team appealed the decision. While the appeal was pending, the case was remanded to allow the defense lawyers to present additional evidence that Samantha had confessed. 4 people testified that Samantha had admitted to them that she killed her mother and grandmother. Samantha's friend, Nicole Casey, testified that on 2 different occasions in 2010, Samantha admitted to the murders, saying that demons made her do it. 3 of Samantha's former neighbors also testified that Samantha admitted to the murders in 3 separate instances. Despite this, the judge once again ended up denying the motion for a new trial. Finally, in October 2016, the Florida Supreme Court reversed the denial of a new trial, vacated Clemente's convictions and death sentence, and ordered a new trial based on the new evidence that came to light. Despite the new evidence supporting his claims of innocence, the Seminole County State Attorney opted to take him to trial once again, and he was ordered to remain behind bars without bail for another 2 years. In 2018, as the jury was being seated, the state attorney dismissed the charges against Clemente after even more evidence of his innocence emerged. He was granted freedom on November 5, 2018, at 38 years old after 14 years of continuous incarceration. He became the 164th death row exoneree in the nation. On May 19, 1975, 59-year-old Harold Franks, a money order salesman, was confronted by two men attempting to rob him just after leaving a neighborhood convenience store on Fairhill Road in Cleveland, Ohio. When Franks resisted to hand over his briefcase, they bludgeoned him in the head with a pipe and then splashed acid in his face. One of the robbers then shot him twice in the chest and fired a shot through the store's glass front window. While Frank instantly died, 58-year-old Ann Robinson, the co-owner of the store who was shot once in the neck, survived. After this brutal attack, the robbers fled the scene with Franks' briefcase, which only contained about $425. Reports concluded that they fled in a green car that was already parked down the street. Word spread like fire around this heinous crime, which left everybody wondering who could have committed such a horrific murder in their small town. As law enforcement began their investigation, there were not many leads to follow. Detectives started by questioning residents from the nearby area. This was when they came across an eyewitness who would forever change the path of the investigation, as well as the fate of three young people. The eyewitness was a 12-year-old neighborhood paperboy, Eddie Vernon. He implicated three people in the crime: 18-year-old Ricky Jackson, 17-year-old Ronnie Bridgman, and his 20-year-old brother Wiley Bridgman. They'd all grown up in the same neighborhood and knew each other well. Eddie knew the trio through Ricky's younger brother, who he was friends with. Both Wiley and Ronnie were good friends with Ricky. Eddie identified Ricky Jackson as the gunman and claimed that Ronnie was assisting him during the robbery while his brother Wiley drove the getaway car. Just 6 days after the murder of Harold Franks, on May 25, 1975, Eddie gave their names in a police interview. On the same night, police went to the Bridgman house and arrested the Bridgman brothers along with Ricky, who just happened to be there that night. None of them had any criminal record, but police treated them as brutal murderers from the onset. After putting all three in a police lineup, Eddie Vernon was called to identify them. Once they were identified by Eddie, all three were charged with aggravated murder, aggravated attempted murder, and aggravated robbery, despite no physical or forensic evidence tying them to the crime. Neither the green car nor the murder weapon was ever found. Each of them was tried separately in Cuyahoga County Court. The prosecution's case rested almost solely on the testimony of Eddie Vernon, who had turned 13 by the time he testified. Although the female store owner, Ann Robinson, had been a survivor of the robbery, she never saw the faces of the perpetrators before being shot. However, as significant as Eddie's testimony was in this case, it was inconsistent. He initially told police that he was on the bus coming home from school when he saw the two men attack Franks as he got out of his car and walked to the store. During the trial, he testified that he'd already gotten off the bus when he saw the attack, and that the attack occurred as Franks emerged from the store. To counter Eddie's claim, the defense brought on a 16-year-old neighborhood girl who had walked into the store just before the attack and saw two men outside the store. She testified that neither of the two men were Jackson or the Bridgman brothers. Several of Eddie's classmates testified that he was on the bus with them when they heard the gunshots and that none of them were able to see the robbers. Additional witnesses testified that the accused young men were elsewhere during the murder. Despite that, the jury sided with the prosecution and declared all three men guilty. Wiley Bridgman was convicted on August 12, 1975, Ricky Jackson was convicted on August 13, 1975, and Ronnie Bridgman was convicted on September 27, 1975. Throughout the entire ordeal, all three denied they were involved in the crime. They claimed they were not present at the scene during the time of the crime, but went there as a part of a gathering of 100 people after the news spread. Just months after their arrests, all three of them were sentenced to death. With that, three bright futures were forever destroyed. Ricky had been in the U.S. Marines. He received a medical discharge for a bad back and, after treatment, intended to re-enlist. Wiley Bridgman was in the Army National Guard, and Ronnie Bridgman was in the process of joining the Navy. None of them could ever pursue serving their country again. Instead, they'd be serving years behind bars. In 1977, their sentences were commuted to life. In 2002, Wiley Bridgman was granted parole. Unfortunately, he had an accidental encounter with Eddie Vernon in the shelter he was staying, where Eddie was working as a security guard. Because contacting the state witness was prohibited by the terms of Wiley's parole, his parole was revoked and he was sent back to prison. In January 2003, Ronnie Bridgman was released from prison on parole. Although he now had a chance to rebuild his life, the stigma of being a murderer remained on his record and in his heart. In an attempt to get away from it, he formally changed his name to Kwame Ajamu. In 2011, Cleveland Scene magazine published a detailed examination of the case and pointed out the numerous inconsistencies in Eddie Vernon's testimony and the absence of any other evidence linking Ricky Jackson and the Bridgman brothers to the crime. The article highlighted the fact that Eddie had been paid $50 by Ann Robinson's husband to testify at the trial, a crucial piece of evidence that was never mentioned in the trial. Kyle Swenson, the writer of the article and a reporter by profession, attempted to interview Eddie, but he refused to talk about the case. Swenson then reached out to Eddie's pastor, Arthur Singleton. When Singleton mentioned to Eddie that a reporter wanted to talk to him, Eddie brushed off the topic, telling the pastor to ignore the reporter. Singleton later said in a sworn affidavit that he asked Eddie again about the article a few months later. This time, Eddie confessed to him that he had lied to the police when he said he had witnessed the crime in 1975, which put 3 innocent men in prison for murder. He claimed that when he was brought in to identify the suspects from the police lineup, he tried to back off from the lie, but it was too late to change his story. When he refused to reaffirm what he had previously told the detectives put him in a room and coerced him to repeat the same identifications, threatening that his parents would be sent to jail for perjury if he didn't. Prompted by this recantation, attorneys from the Ohio Innocence Project filed a petition for a new trial on behalf of Ricky, presenting many other new pieces of evidence along with it. Similar petitions were later filed on behalf of Wiley Bridgman and Kwame Ajamu. In November 2014, Judge Richard McMonigal held a hearing on Ricky's motion for a new trial. Eddie testified that not only police threatened him for refusing to identify the 3 accused in a lineup, but they also fed him the information of the crime, such as the number of assailants, the weapon used, and the make and model of the getaway car, none of which he had any previous knowledge of. Eddie told the judge that he was on the bus when he heard 2 gunshots that sounded like firecrackers. The bus was close to the store where the crime occurred, but not near enough that he could see the crime with his own eyes. Yet, based on a rumor he heard in the street, he went to the scene and told police that Jackson and the Bridgman brothers committed the crime. Based on the emerging evidence, on November 21, 2014, all charges were dropped against Wiley Bridgman and Jackson, which prompted their release from the prison. After serving 39 years, 3 months and 9 days, Ricky Jackson became the longest-serving prison exoneree in U.S. history. On December 9, 2014, Ajamu's conviction was vacated and the prosecution dismissed the charges against him.
Wiley Bridgman, Ricky Jackson. It is my hope that from this day on we can stop ignoring what is obvious in the criminal justice system and move forward to peace and love and harmony. I have no bitter feelings towards anyone.
In May 2020, the 3 men settled their lawsuit against the city of Cleveland, with Jackson receiving $7.2 million and Bridgman and Ajamu each receiving $5.4 million. Sadly, in June 2021, Bridgman died of complications from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. On April 14, 1998, 32-year-old Terry Cheek did not show up for a night shift at Quest Diagnostics, a lab testing facility in San Juan Capistrano, California, after leaving her house at around 10 p.m. Shortly before midnight on the same night, a California Highway Patrol officer spotted a Nissan truck with its headlights flashing parked on the southbound shoulder of Interstate 15, which was located between Terry's home and her workplace. The truck was locked and did not appear to have been disturbed. The officer left a notice saying it would be towed if not removed in 72 hours. After that time had expired, the vehicle was indeed towed. 4 days later, on April 18, 1998, 3 fishermen found Terry's strangled body along the highway near a rocky shore of Corona Lake, about 1.2 miles west of where the pickup truck had been found parked. The rope which was used to strangle her was found near her body. A wristwatch was also found with the corpse, which would prove to be significant. Some tire tracks were also found near the body. As Terry's family was informed about her untimely demise, police also began to question the family members in order to gain information. The family would tell the investigators that the last persons to see her were her 2 daughters and her estranged husband, Googie Harris Sr., with whom Terry was in the process of a messy divorce. But Terry had another person in her life who soon turned into a person of interest. After talking to the family members, the police discovered that Terry was having an affair with their supervisor at work, 40-year-old Horace Roberts. Terry's husband, as well as Roberts' wife Deborah, were aware of the affair. The affair was the key factor for Terry's divorce. It was Horace's truck that was found abandoned on I-15. Although Harris initially said that when Terry left for work on the night she was last seen, she was driving a Nissan truck belonging to Horace, he quickly changed his account to say that she left in her Volkswagen convertible. Detectives at the time assumed that she must have been going to pick up Horace, who was living in Temecula, California, before going to work. Police focused on Horace as a suspect after he repeatedly denied that he was having an affair with Terry, despite the affair being the reason for Terry's divorce and known by several co-workers. Yet the lies about the affair wasn't the only thing that caught the attention of the investigators. When police discovered the Loris wristwatch that was found near Terry's body was similar to a watch that Horace Roberts was known to wear, upon questioning about the watch, Horace initially denied that the watch was his. However, he later admitted that it was his, but said that he had not worn it in some time because it no longer worked. He subsequently changed his story again, saying that he had given the watch to a friend. Horace's wife, Deborah, turned over several watches to the police that he owned and often wore, including 2 that were very similar in appearance to the Loris watch. Horace was arrested on the charge of second-degree murder on April 27, 1998. He went to trial in Riverside County Superior Court in March 1999. Evidence presented by the prosecution showed that Terry was hit on the head and then strangled with a rope that was found near the body. The prosecution presented evidence that Horace went to work the night Terry disappeared, and his versions of his whereabouts were inconsistent. Horace hid the fact that Terry picked him up for work regularly from the police. In the trial, he disclosed the fact that he wanted to keep his affair hidden as his employer might fire him if it was revealed that he and Terry were having an extramarital affair. The prosecution surmised that Horace needed a ride to work as he'd left his truck on the highway after killing Terry. Evidence of Terry and Horace arguing on March 18th and April 12, 1998 were also presented. Moreover, the prosecution brought up the fact that a purse belonging to Terry was found in Horace's apartment in Temecula, where they both lived together for some time. One of Terry's daughters from a previous relationship testified that Terry was carrying the purse the night she was last seen alive. But the focal point of the prosecution's argument was the watch that was found next to the victim's body. The defense, however, argued that there was neither any physical evidence to tie Horace to Terry's murder, nor any eyewitness to implicate him in the crime. The first trial was declared a mistrial in April 1999, when the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict due to the conflicting evidence in the case. In May 1999, Horace went to trial a second time, but by June of that year, another mistrial was declared when the second jury, too, was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The following month, Horace went to trial for a third time. On July 16th, the jury convicted Roberts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 15 years to life in prison. In 2000, California's 4th District Court of Appeal upheld his conviction. Over the next 3 years, Roberts filed 2 separate state petitions and a federal petition, but all were denied. In 2003, the California Innocence Project at California Western School of Law became involved with Roberts' case and ultimately petitioned for DNA testing. In 2013, lawyers for Horace filed a petition seeking a new trial, citing the DNA testing results performed on the wristwatch found near Terry's body. The petition said that a mixture of DNA from at least 3 males was found on the wristband, and none of them included Horace. Shockingly, the major contributor of the DNA was Harris's son, Googie Harris Jr. The petition also pointed out that the rope found near Terry's body was orange and black, the same kind that Harris Sr. used for his dog. A strand from the rope found at the scene was consistent with a rope found at Harris's home. Tire tracks found near Terry's body were traced back to Temescal Canyon Road, which did not match those of Roberts' truck, which was found abandoned. But even with these damning pieces of evidence, the petition was denied in 2014. As years passed, more DNA testing was performed, which further excluded Horace as the probable killer. Tests on fingernail clippings from Terry's left hand were matched to 52-year-old Joaquin Leal, Harris Sr.'s nephew and a convicted sex offender. In addition, DNA tests on a right-hand fingernail clipping from Terry and an apparent bloodstain on her front right pants was the profile of an unidentified male. In May 2018, lawyers from the California Innocence Project requested Riverside County District Attorney to re-examine Roberts' case. The case was sent to the Conviction Review Unit, established in 2015. On October 2, 2018, the prosecution agreed to vacate Roberts' conviction and further agreed to his immediate release from prison. But due to the newly launched ongoing investigation, Horace's release was kept secret from the public by sealing all proceedings. On October 3, 2018, after being granted a certificate of innocence, Horace walked out of Avino State Prison. On October 15, 2018, the District Attorney's Office announced that Horace was exonerated. Murder charges were filed against Googie Harris Sr. and his nephew Joaquin Leal. In November 2018, Leal and Harris pled not guilty to the murder. In December 2019, Googie Harris Jr. was arrested and charged with participating in the murder. It was surmised that Harris Sr. grew jealous of his wife's affair with Horace and killed her to get revenge with the help of his son and nephew. They then staged the crime scene to frame Horace. In 2019, Horace sued Riverside County and its Sheriff's Department for their mishandling of his case, which led to his wrongful conviction. He received an $11 million settlement from the county on May 25, 2021, for serving 19 years behind bars without committing any crime. On the afternoon of July 29, 1985, Penny Ann Bjornson, a 36-year-old small business co-owner and physical fitness instructor from Wisconsin, went through a traumatic experience. She was enjoying a day with her daughter and husband at a state beach on Lake Michigan when she decided to go for a jog. She had no idea that this decision would come back to haunt her forever. She started the jog at 3:50 p.m. while looking forward to a meeting with her father at the beach at 4 p.m. That meeting would never take place, as just a few minutes after the jogging, Penny was grabbed from behind by a man wearing a leather jacket. The man forcibly took Penny into the wooded area and sexually assaulted her. When Penny started resisting, he repeatedly choked her and beat her until she passed out. When she woke up again, the man was gone, leaving her to die. 2 people found her naked and severely injured, but thankfully just in time to save her life. After being taken to the hospital, a sexual assault kit was performed on her. The 13 strands of pubic hair that were discovered on her body were collected and preserved as evidence. Along with that, fingernail scrapings were also collected from Penny. After Penny had given a detailed description of her attacker, based on that physical description of her attacker, police compiled a photo array of 9 men. After closely looking at all the photos, Penny finally picked a man, 22-year-old Stephen Avery. Later, out of an 8-man live lineup at the sheriff's office, Penny again picked the same man. Oddly, Stephen was the only man who was present both in the photo lineup and the live lineup. Stephen Avery belonged to a family that owned an auto salvage family business named Avery Auto Salvage. Stephen's father, Alan Avery, turned what was once a farm into a giant repository for junked cars and trucks. The family lived on the business property and was described as aloof by others in the small town of Two Rivers, Wisconsin. Stephen reportedly had an IQ of 70 and was a high school dropout. Even at a young age, Stephen repeatedly got into trouble. In 1981, he was convicted of burglarizing a bar, which resulted in 10 months behind bars. The following year, he pled guilty to animal cruelty after he poured gasoline on a cat and tossed it into a bonfire. This time, he was sentenced to 9 months. In 1985, he again ran afoul of the law when he forced a car driven by one of his cousins, Sandra Morris, who was also the wife of a sheriff's deputy, off the road and pointed a rifle at her. Stephen claimed that he wanted her to stop spreading rumors about him, and the rifle had no bullets in it. In 1985, 22-year-old Stephen was living with his wife and children in a house that was near the Avery business property. It was at this time when he was accused of the rape of Penny Bjornson. Although Penny had positively identified Stephen, there were a lot of things that did not add up. Stephen wasn't nearly as tall as the man described, and his eyes were a different color than what Penny had initially described. Additionally, Penny told the investigators that the perpetrator was wearing white underwear, but Stephen did not even own any. But these anomalies did not seem to matter to the deputies of Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office. The investigation was very brief. Only 2 days after Penny implicated Stephen in her sexual assault, police arrested him from his home in Two Rivers, Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. In the trial, Stephen's defense presented a whopping 16 alibi witnesses, including the clerk of a store in Green Bay, Wisconsin, who recalled Stephen was accompanying his wife and 5 children to buy a gallon of paint in the store. A checkout tape put the timestamp of the purchase at 5:13 p.m. According to Penny Bjornson, the attack started at 3:50 p.m. and lasted about 15 minutes, which meant that Avery would have had to leave the scene of the attack, walk a mile to the nearest parking area, drive home, load his family into the car, and drive 45 miles to Green Bay to purchase the paint by 5:13 p.m. And all of this in a time span of just over an hour. Despite the timeline seeming impossible, a police officer shared a version before the jury where Avery managed to make this trip in 57 minutes. However, the officer did not account for loading the family into the car, and he exceeded the speed limit by an average of 10 miles an hour. The hair that was preserved as evidence was never tested against Stephen. The trial did not end in Avery's favor. The jury deliberated for 4 hours over 2 days and convicted Avery on December 14, 1985. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Regardless of Penny's claim and the jury's verdict, Avery's family never believed in his guilt. The family, especially Stephen's parents, always stood by him in his battle for justice. Several of his friends and family members believed Sandra Morris and her husband had something to do with Stephen's conviction, but nobody had any proof of that. As years passed, the hope of freedom started fading away, but Stephen always maintained his innocence. From 1986 to 1994, Stephen appealed his conviction up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. In 2001, the Wisconsin Innocence Project became involved in his case. They provided funding for defense lawyers, who started diligently working on the case. The following year, a court order granted permission to perform DNA testing of the pubic hairs found on the victim. The result was shocking. It did not match Stephen. Instead, the DNA profile developed from the hairs hit a match in the CODIS database. The match was for Gregory Allen, a notorious sexual predator who lived in the area at the time. Allen, who was under suspicion for a number of sex crimes in Manitowoc back in the summer of 1985, was on the radar of police during the time of the crime. In fact, police were regularly monitoring Allen at the time, except the very afternoon when Penny was assaulted. During the legal proceedings, it was also discovered that in 1995, detectives had learned that Allen, who was serving time in a nearby Brown County prison, confessed to having committed a sexual assault in Manitowoc County for which someone else was convicted. Authorities, however, never pursued the claim. All charges against Avery were dropped once DNA identified Allen, and he was released from prison on September 11, 2003. By that time, his wife had divorced him, and he was estranged from his family. But even then, his freedom was sweet after 18 long years serving time for a crime he never committed. The victim, Penny, who initially identified him as her culprit, admitted her fault and said she was gravely sorry for sending him to prison. The only one who did not admit their fault was the law enforcement. Therefore, Stephen filed a $36 million wrongful conviction lawsuit against the county, the district attorney, and the sheriff. Stephen's freedom wouldn't last long, however. While the lawsuit was still in process, Stephen would go away for an even more sinister crime. It was November 3, 2005, when Teresa Halbach was reported missing after she hadn't been heard from for 4 days. A photographer by profession, Teresa had an appointment at the Avery family business to photograph a vehicle on October 31, 2005, which was the last day she was seen. Teresa's vehicle was found partially concealed in the salvage yard, and bloodstains recovered from its interior matched Stephen's DNA. Her car keys were also found in Stephen's bedroom. Investigators later identified charred bone fragments found in a burn pit near Stephen's home. On November 11, 2005, Stephen was arrested and charged with Hallback's murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, maiming of a corpse, and a weapons violation. However, Stephen maintained that the murder charge was a frame-up to discredit his pending civil suit. His attorneys claimed that there was a conflict of interest in the participation of law enforcement and suggested evidence tampering. In March 2006, Brendan Dassey, Avery's 16-year-old nephew, who reportedly had an IQ of 73, told police detectives that he and Avery had raped and murdered Hallback before burning her body. However, Brendan was interviewed without legal representation or a parent. He later recanted, claiming that the confession was coerced. However, Brendan was also charged with various crimes related to the murder, although there was no physical evidence against him. On March 18, 2007, Stephen was found guilty of first-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm, but was acquitted on the corpse mutilation charge. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole on the murder conviction, plus 5 years on the weapons charge, to run concurrently. In April 2007, Brendan was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 2048. Stephen Avery was the focus of a popular Netflix documentary called Making a Murderer, released in 2015. As of 2022, Stephen Avery's lawyers are trying to overturn the murder conviction, claiming they have significant evidence. There's no doubt that lies were outmatched by the truth in the end, but not before lives of those innocent people were destroyed in such a way that could never be compensated. What do you think could have been done differently in these cases to avoid these innocent people serving years for crimes they did not commit? Let us know your thoughts on these tragic cases in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating true crime stories.